The tension between the Eastern Bloc and the Western Bloc continued to rise during the Cold War, and both sides continued to make speeches against each other. In this tense atmosphere, the United States and NATO conducted a massive military exercise involving all NATO countries and forces. The Soviets considered this to be a declaration of war and began to prepare for it, including preparing nuclear weapons. The war was about to break out, but one man managed to save the world from that war. Who is this person? How did he do it? Who was he working for, and what was his fate? Follow this story to the end, as it is full of exciting and unexpected events. Welcome everybody to our channel. In 1966, the Soviet intelligence agency, the KGB, sent a spy to Denmark, which was an ally of the United States and the closest Western ally to Soviet territory. This meant that it was a very important country, and most of the staff at the Soviet embassy in the Danish capital, Copenhagen, were KGB agents. The spy, named Oleg Gordievsky, was sent under the cover of a diplomat. After arriving in Denmark, he began visiting cemeteries and clergymen in order to collect the identities of the dead and then give those identities to other spies so they could move freely around the country. On the other hand, the Danish intelligence services were aware of all his movements because they had been monitoring him since he arrived. They suspected that he was a spy, because they also knew that many of the staff at the Soviet embassy were also spies. They suspected that he would be another spy, and their suspicions were confirmed by their surveillance. However, they did not arrest him. Instead, they decided to continue monitoring him, hoping that they could recruit him to be a double agent working for them, bringing them information about the Soviet Union. However, they were not very hopeful that they would be able to do so. In the meantime, after Oleg Gordievsky had spent a long time in Denmark, his thinking began to change and he began to admire the ideas and lifestyle of the West there. The Danish intelligence services continued to monitor him until 1968, when something happened that changed everything. In this year, there were many protests in a Soviet-allied country, Czechoslovakia, which later split into two countries, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. In any case, the situation was very tense, and in order to stop those protests, the Soviet Union sent a lot of military forces there, which led to the deaths of hundreds of people. This news spread everywhere through the press. One day, Oleg was reading the newspaper and he read that news that the Soviet Union had killed many people in Czechoslovakia, which is their ally. He was very affected and felt great sadness. Then he called his wife in Moscow and started telling her about his feelings and sorrows, and that the system that the Soviet Union was based on was no longer to his liking. While he was talking to his wife, the Danish intelligence services were spying on his call. They had heard all his words. They began to see that there was a great possibility of being able to benefit from him and recruit him to work as a double agent with them. However, before they could contact him, he had returned to the KGB headquarters in Moscow due to the end of his 4-year mission. Oleg remained in Moscow for 4 years. In 1972, he was sent back to Denmark on a new mission. He was also promoted to Deputy Commander of Intelligence Operations in Denmark. As soon as he arrived in Denmark, the intelligence there had learned of the matter. They still wanted to recruit him to become a double agent with them. However, due to their lack of the necessary capabilities to do so, they contacted the British intelligence, MI6, and gave them all the information they had gathered on Oleg Gordievsky. They asked them to recruit him as a double agent to benefit from him. MI6 agreed to this after reviewing that information and finding that Oleg was very suitable for that. Then they began to monitor all his movements. They found that he is a man who loves to exercise and that he plays badminton in a hall where there is no one from his colleagues. They continued to monitor him and collect information about him until 1974. In one of the days of that year, some MI6 agents went to one of the badminton halls to meet Oleg. When they arrived to him, they offered him to work for them. Oleg was surprised and thought that those who were talking to him were KGB agents and that they were testing his loyalty. He said that he would think about it first, and then he agreed with them to meet in one of the hotels after a few days. After that, Oleg began to think about it, as he had already been convinced by the ideas of the Western Bloc. He wanted to agree to the offer. At the same time, he was afraid that it was a test of his loyalty to the Soviet Union. After deep thought, he decided to accept the offer. In the event that it was a test, he would tell them that he had agreed to it in order to spy on British intelligence. After that, the day of the meeting came. Oleg went to the agreed hotel and met MI6 agents. He told them that he would agree on the following conditions. Denmark should not be involved in the matter, as there are many KGB agents in the Soviet embassy in Denmark. Therefore, it is possible that his case will be discovered. His colleagues in the Soviet embassy should not be harmed. The matter should remain secret between them, and it should not be told to anyone, no matter how important their position in the state, except for senior intelligence officers. He will not take any money in return for the information he will bring them, and they should not track his movements or take pictures of him. After a lot of negotiations between the two parties, which lasted for several days, an agreement was finally reached between the two parties, and Oleg became a double agent for the British intelligence, MI6, and he began to carry out his new tasks and leak important and sensitive information about the Soviet Union. Among these tasks was that he smuggled a film strip from the Soviet embassy containing highly confidential information, and gave it to one of the MI6 agents, who copied it and then returned it to Oleg to return it to its place. That strip contained photos and documents with all the names and information of the Soviet spies who were in the Nordic countries, and information about the mechanism of work and recruiting spies. Oleg continued to provide the British intelligence with important information until 1978. In this year, Oleg was required to return to Moscow due to the end of his mission, which was assigned to him by the Soviet Union, there in Denmark. Before his return, the British intelligence gave him a phone number and told him that he could contact them through it at any time. Then he returned to Moscow and stayed there until 1982. During this period, there was no contact between him and MI6 in order to avoid being exposed. Finally, in 1982, Oleg was sent on a new mission. The destination of the mission was the place Oleg had been hoping for. Yes, it was London, the capital of Britain. After arriving in Britain, he contacted that number that MI6 had given him 4 years ago, and then began secret meetings with them. Those meetings were very few compared to the meetings that were in Denmark, due to the large number of Soviet spies in Britain. Then he began to bring them important information, which showed that many politicians in Britain hold communist ideas. After Oleg brought them this important information, they knew that he was a very important agent for them and that they must protect him and keep his matter a secret in order to provide him with the greatest possible protection. They also gave him some information to give to the KGB so that they would believe that he was still working for them and was not suspicious of anything. This information that Oleg was giving to the KGB led to his promotion to the rank of major in 1983. He was also appointed commander of the intelligence center in London, and he was able to see all the important papers and documents. On the other hand, the situation of the Cold War was in constant tension, as both the President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, and the President of the Soviet Union, Yuri Andropov, were giving speeches attacking each other. The Soviet president came to believe that America was preparing for a nuclear attack on them. He ordered the KGB to direct all spies to collect information that would prove his suspicions. Among this information that he ordered them to collect were the times when the lights were on in military buildings, monitoring the amount of blood donated in American hospitals. The situation continued in this way, and the tension between the two sides continued to escalate until the end of 1983, when Yuri Andropov became completely convinced that the United States was preparing for a nuclear war against them. What increased his suspicions was that in that period, specifically in November, the United States and NATO conducted a very large and wide-ranging military exercise called Able Archer, with the participation of all NATO countries. The Soviet response was that they considered it an announcement of the start of the war. They equipped their military forces with huge numbers of all kinds, and equipped them with nuclear-carrying missiles in preparation for war. They directed missiles carrying nuclear warheads towards the most important European cities belonging to NATO. The United States and NATO did not know what was happening in the Soviet Union. The only one who knew what was happening on both sides was Oleg Gordievsky, who realized the seriousness of the situation and that things could lead to a nuclear war. He contacted MI6, risking himself, because they had agreed between them that there would be specific meetings between them at specific times in order not to arouse suspicion and reveal his matter. Despite this, he contacted them because of the seriousness of the situation and told them that the Soviet reaction to those NATO military exercises was very serious and that they were preparing for war. He gave them all the documents that confirmed his words and showed the seriousness of the situation. MI6 took the matter seriously and was convinced of the seriousness of the situation. They informed Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher of the seriousness of the situation, telling her that the information came from a very reliable source. Of course, they did not tell her about Oleg, because they had agreed with him to keep his matter a secret from anyone, regardless of their position in the state. Margaret went to US President Ronald Reagan and asked him to stop the military exercises and to reduce the severity of the speeches he was making against the Soviet Union, due to the seriousness of the situation. Thanks to the good relations between the United States and Britain, Margaret Thatcher was able to convince him of that. Then diplomatic meetings were held between the two sides, and the situation that was very tense was then calmed down. In this way, Oleg saved the world from a major nuclear war through those information he leaked. After that, the US intelligence agency, the CIA, began to want to know the source of the accurate and important information that the British had, especially since this was not the first time that the Americans had seen that the British intelligence had important information about the Soviet Union. This is because the British intelligence was sharing some of the information it obtained from Oleg with the American intelligence, without telling them about the real source of it. The American intelligence asked the British intelligence about the source of that information, and they replied that it was from different sources and spies. But the American intelligence was not convinced, because the information was very accurate. Then the CIA concluded that there was an important British spy working in a senior position in the Soviet Union. They launched an intelligence operation to uncover the identity of this spy, led by Aldrich Ames, who was the head of the Soviet counterintelligence unit. The investigation and information gathering process began, and after a full year, they were able to identify the identity of that spy, and they knew that he was Oleg Gordievsky. But then something unexpected happened. On May 17, 1985, Oleg was summoned by the KGB to return to Moscow, and he was told that he would be promoted. He suspected that they had discovered his matter because it had not been long since his promotion. He told MI6 about that, and they told him to stay in Britain and cut off his connection with the Soviets. After careful consideration, Oleg decided to carry out the order and return to Moscow, but he put a plan with MI6 to smuggle him out if there was a danger to him. After returning to Moscow, Oleg found a group of KGB officers waiting for him. They took him to an isolated place and gave him a drink in a glass and asked him to drink it. The drink contained a chemical compound called truth serum, which makes the person who drinks it drunk and unable to lie, and only tells the truth. However, spies undergo training to resist these types of compounds. Then they began to interrogate him and asked him if he was a traitor. This is because they had begun to suspect him after he was reported by Aldrich Ames, the person who was the head of the Soviet counterintelligence unit in the United States, who was appointed by the CIA to find out Oleg's identity, and reported him to the KGB after he knew him. Because Aldrich is actually a double agent working for the Soviet intelligence, the KGB. In the end, after Oleg drank that serum, he fell to the ground and became drunk. Then the officer asked him if he was a traitor. Oleg replied that he was not a traitor because he was able to resist the truth serum, and it did not affect him completely. He was then released but placed under house arrest, and continued to be monitored in order to make sure of his matter. After that, he began to implement the escape plan that he had put in place with the British intelligence, which was a very smart plan. He went in the morning at exactly 7 o'clock to a previously agreed place, and he was carrying a distinctive plastic bag that he had brought with him from Britain. He then sat on a chair under a street lamp. After 4 minutes, a man passed in front of him eating a certain type of chocolate. This was the signal that Oleg had agreed with MI6 to let them know that he wanted to escape from the country. The man who passed in front of Oleg was one of MI6's agents in Moscow. The agreement between Oleg and the British intelligence was that the escape operation would begin 4 days after he informed them of his desire to escape. Oleg was able to give the signal without the KGB agents who were monitoring him suspecting him. 4 days later, the day of the escape came. Oleg left his house to go to the agreed place, and the KGB agents were chasing him. So he went to the train station and boarded the train. The KGB agents boarded the train after him. Then he got off the train immediately before the doors closed. The KGB agents could not get off and the train doors closed and the train left. Then Oleg boarded several consecutive trains, and the next day he arrived at a place located 50 kilometers from the Finnish border. This was the agreed place. He stayed there until 2 p.m., then MI6 agents arrived. Oleg was placed in the trunk of the car and they drove off. They were able to cross the checkpoints successfully because the border guards were not interested in inspecting cars leaving Soviet territory, but were inspecting cars entering. Then they arrived in Finland and Oleg's escape operation was successfully completed. Then he was honored in Britain and awarded medals. In the Soviet Union, he was sentenced in absentia to death. Now, this is the end of the story. We hope you enjoyed your time with us. Write for us your opinions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share it with your friends.